Welcome back to lab discussion number 6. This is Professor Klein coming to you from Ping Center because today we're talking about the trunk, muscles, joints, and ligaments in the body. So we're going to talk a lot about exercise and stretching and things you would do in the gym. But before we get to the muscles, we got to first talk about the joints. We got the skeleton right here. We've done the skeletal system. We've done the bones and the bony landmarks. Now we've got to talk about what happens when you bring two bones together. So that's what we call a joint. And a joint, when two bones come together, forms an articulation. So, for example, where this humerus and the glenoid cavity of the scapula come together, forms the glenohumeral joint. Glenohumeral joint, little shoulder dislocation going on here, but when those two bones come together, it forms that joint. And there's three main categories of joints: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. So three big categories for joints here. Underneath those categories, you've got subcategories. Syndesmosis would be something like the forearm in between your ulna and radius, kind of holding those together. Gomphosis, think of your teeth, very fibrous joints in your teeth. You do not want your teeth falling out, so that's a gomphosis joint. Cartilaginous joints, though, they're a little bit more like the rib cage. You got primary and secondary ones here, but more like that hyaline cartilage that makes up the costal cartilages of the rib cage. And then finally, the one we're going to be focusing on the most is synovial joints. And when you think synovial, I want you to think of movement. Maybe get some arm circle going wherever you're at. Get some movement, and those are the 6 different joints we're going to talk about there. And with synovial joints, you can see the 6 different types right here. For example, that ball and socket joint of the shoulder or the hip, pivot joint of the elbow, saddle joint, episolar joint, hinge, and plane. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's so many to go through. Check out your lab manual, though, and watch this video down here. This video has all the joints that you need to know for your lab manual. So check it out and fill out your lab manual while you're doing it. And with joints, ligaments, tendons, muscles, let's define a few things first. First, we got to say that muscles pull. A muscle has generally 2 attachments, and it will pull on one of those attachment points to bring those 2 attachment places, one being the origin, one being the insertion, closer together. That's what muscles do. They do not push. Next, tendons attach muscle to bone. So muscles aren't directly attached to the skeleton. There's a little bit of a tendon, sometimes a big tendon, in between that muscle and bone. Next, the origin is the attachment that's closer to the trunk. So typically it's more proximal, but you also got to know it's less movable, which means if I'm going to move, let's say, my bicep muscle and contract it, way out here, this would be the insertion point. My forearm is going to move. Up here is the origin. I'm not going to move my whole body when I contract my biceps, just my arm for that. So we'll take a look at a few examples of all these things right now. First one is that tendon-muscle relationship here. You can see the tendon as this white structure here. Quiz for you: what type of tissue make up tendons? Actually, tendons and ligaments have the same type, and I'll tell you it's a type of connective tissue. Take 10 seconds and try to figure out what type of connective tissue that is. If you said dense, regular connective tissue, you would be correct. You guys remember dense, regular connective tissue has parallel collagen fibers going in the same direction. So parallel collagen fibers, just like these black lines on the page. And another view of a tendon would be like the Achilles tendon, one of the most famous tendons and the strongest tendon in the body. But you know what? Let's dive into this and see what it actually looks like. All right, here we are inside the tendon, and now you can see the parallel fibers running in the same direction, which means a tendon is strong. There we go. Is strong in the direction of the collagen fibers. So hopefully you remember this from the tissue lab. All right, let's jump back to the PowerPoint and look at the origin and insertion here. I put some O's around the origin up here and an I down by the insertion. The insertion is further from the trunk. It's distal and it's movable. You're gonna move this elbow part up towards the shoulder when you contract the bicep brachii, but the origin is closer to the trunk and it is going to be less movable. So now that we've got those things down, let's move on to our next topic. And our next topic would be, okay, if we know what tendons look like, what about skeletal muscle? You guys remember this from the tissue lab? If not, let's jump into a skeletal muscle and see what it looks like. Whoa. All right, here we are inside skeletal muscle. Looks a lot like the dense regular muscle, but notice these guys up here. Those are the multiple nucleuses within one muscle fiber. A muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. Then you see these striations here. Striations are kind of those wavy purple lines. We'll get into that more, but this is that skeletal muscle from the tissue lab. And if you were to take, let's say, just a small chunk of the skeletal muscle, this is what you would have. You would have the sarcomere. The sarcomere is this subunit of a muscle fiber, and it's got a video down here to walk you through all the components of the sarcomere. But when we're looking at the smallest unit of a muscle, this is what it is. So check this video out. Just start to get the anatomy of the sarcomere model down for a muscle fiber. We'll get into this in the next couple of weeks, but check this video out for what actually makes up a muscle. Next section here, we're going to dive into the movement. So when we talk about actions of a muscle, an action is a movement plus a location. Location would be like glenohumeral joint or the shoulder joint, elbow joint, the wrist. But you got to tell me if you're flexing or extending at the wrist. So movement plus a location is an action. And the first action we'll look at, I'll close my box here, is flexion and extension. Flexion is like bending your knee all the way to where there's a small angle at your knee joint. That would be flexion. But extension is the opposite. Extending is straightening your knee all the way. And that would be knee flexion, knee extension. But if we're talking about the elbow, elbow flexion would be bending your elbow to where there's a very small angle between that joint. Extension of the elbow would be making it straight. That's extension of the elbow. Any type of flexion and extension in your body is going to travel parallel to the sagittal plane. And by parallel to the sagittal plane, we mean it's in line with that sagittal plane. So if I took a piece of paper like this and I held it up in line with the sagittal plane, and then I performed flexion and extension, that movement would travel parallel to that piece of paper. So we say flexion and extension occurs in the sagittal plane or parallel to the sagittal plane. Let's keep going with some of these, and let's talk about scapular movements, because with the trunk in the back, we're dealing a lot with the scapula. So I'll bring my skeleton back into the frame here, spin it on around, and now we can see the scapula bones on the posterior aspect of the rib cage. Now what's happening here is a lot of stuff. Actually, 6 different actions to be complete. If you look over here, you can see the scapular elevation and depression. And I've got a couple of videos showing you elevation, like shrugging your shoulders. The scapula move upwards or more superior. And depression, trying to pull your shoulders downward inferiorly, that's depression. But then you also have retraction, which would be like pinching your shoulder blades together, like that guy over here in the far right is doing, versus protraction. Protraction is the opposite. Extend your arms on out, and you'll feel your shoulder blades or your scapula move anteriorly. So this is the part where you get active and you say, okay, let me try to feel scapular elevation. Go ahead, at home, wherever you're at, give me some scapular elevation. Feel that scapula elevate. Then depress it. Try to pull your shoulder blades down as well. Retraction, protraction. Try it out, and the more that you feel these actions, the easier it'll be to learn. Next 2 up is abduction and adduction. So abduction or adduction of the shoulder, or you could say the hip as well, are the main 2 locations that this occurs. Abduction would be raising your arm up. Go ahead and try this, just like that video is showing. Mainly the deltoids working here. It's moving the arm away from the body. AB, away from the body, but adduction is bringing it back to your body. So I always think you're going to add your arm back to your body when you adduct it, and when you abduct it, you're taking it away. So try a few of those out. That's like doing a jumping jack if you do them back and forth. And this motion occurs in the frontal plane. So I got my piece of paper here. I pull out in the frontal plane, and I go up and down, up and down. It's moving parallel to the frontal plane. Any abduction, adduction is parallel to the frontal plane. All right, so take a second on those, recap this PowerPoint before you move on, because the last one we're going to talk about here with the shoulder is internal and external rotation. So you're literally rotating this humerus. I'll grab this one and blow my screen up here. You guys can see that I'm actually going to rotate the humerus. So this is internal rotation, where the head of the humerus turns inward, and then external rotation, it's going to rotate out or laterally. So that's what's going on in this picture here. Here's external rotation. Huge in baseball. When you whip back your hand, you externally rotate it, and then would be internal rotation on the follow through for that baseball pitch. But if I get these videos going here, you can see an external rotation exercise as pulling that cable machine outward away from the body. Couple more that we'll get to in future labs, but I wanted to mention them now. We've got dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. Dorsiflexion is where you're finishing here and the toes are pointed up towards the sky or the ceiling. Plantarflexion is pointing the toes, like you can see here in the start position, and pointing them downward. That's plantarflexion. That's occurring at the ankle joint, the talocrural joint. Professor Klein, let's save it for the lower body. I agree, but just wanted to show you that, guys, that right now. Also wanted to show you inversion and eversion, another one at the ankle that we'll get to later, but there's more than just flexion and extension. Here's eversion and inversion occurring at the ankle. But back to the trunk, and with the trunk, we can do trunk flexion. I close my box here. You can see trunk flexion, like bending down to touch your toes. And really what you're looking at here, if I drew a line through this person's hip and down, it's a lot less of an angle than trunk extension, which would be like leaning back. Go ahead and lean back in your chair or wherever you're at. Lean back, and that would be trunk extension. If I do it on the skeleton here, real quick, I've got trunk extension as that motion, or you could call it back extension or lumbar extension, as well as trunk flexion, flexing the trunk forward into the anterior direction. But there's another picture on here that says lateral flexion. That's basically a side bend. So if you're doing a side bend, that's a lateral flexion of the trunk. Just like if you were to laterally flex your neck, you'd be bending your neck to one side. That's a lateral flexion. And you can also do trunk rotation. So you might have done these twister style exercises wherever you're at in your chair. Let's give it some twisting motion here. This is going to work the side muscles. We'll get to the obliques, but this is what trunk rotation would look like in the skeleton. Just kind of twisting it left, twisting it right. Don't want to break the skeleton, so I'm not going to do too much. But here's where you see trunk flexion. All right, let's actually get to the muscles now. We've done the actions, we've done the joints. Let's get to the muscles. And here we can see 3 of the 4 abdominal muscles. We've got the internal obliques, the external obliques, and the rectus abdominis. Now, first off, your rectus abdominis is your 6-pack muscle. It's the one that gives that 6-pack or 8-pack type look to the abdominals. It is the most superficial of these 3. And as you go deep, you're going to go rectus abdominis, number 1. Then you're going to go external obliques. And then finally, the deepest are the internal obliques. You can see that down here as those different layers of the abdominal muscle walls. Notice a couple things though. One, notice the orientation of the muscle fibers. The rectus abdominis, it's straight up and down. The word rectus means vertically up and down. So that's rectus abdominis. External oblique though, just like the oblique plane of the body is at an angle, these muscles are at an angle. And the external oblique, if I drew in the other side, it would form a V. So the V shape that some individuals have are formed by these external obliques. But the internal obliques are the opposite. They are going up like this. They form essentially a roof shape. So a roof shape is going to be the internal of V shape for the external and a straight up and down for the rectus abdominis. And we're not so worried about the exact origin and insertion, but you can see up here the insertion is going to be the costal cartilages, and the origin is going to be the pubic symphysis, pubic bones of the pelvis. So after you've got all that, now you add in the fact that muscles pull. And if you were to pull this insertion and this origin, and you were to bring them closer together, that's like from here to here. You were to bring those closer together, that would be trunk flexion. That's a crunch. We all know if you want that six-pack, that's going to be a crunch or trunk flexion. So try that out a few times. Just kind of bend forward, lean forward, and you'll feel that rectus abdominis muscle contract. Now, both the external and internal obliques are for rotation. If they're at an angle, they're going to pull you and rotate you to either side. So give it a few twists here, just like you saw in those videos, and you'll start to feel the oblique muscles contract. All right, so now we're looking at a little bit of surface anatomy, and these are probably Photoshop pictures here to really accentuate the rectus abdominis and some of these other muscles, but it's important to note the muscle fiber orientation for a lot of these muscles from the surface anatomy, and I do tend to start with kind of those individuals with low body fat so that you can see the muscles, but most of your patients will not look like this, but you start here and then you kind of branch your way out from there. So also, the reason why some individuals have a six-pack versus an eight-pack versus a 10-pack all has to do with the connective tissue that divides that rectus abdominis. So that connective tissue, sometimes you have more than the normal amount, and it can make different divisions between that muscle. And then again, just some examples: trunk flexion, that crunch, trunk rotation, the twister exercise for the actions of these muscles. But let's go to a cadaver picture so you can actually see these muscles on a cadaver. And here we go. We can see, well, let's first start on the difference between the rectus abdominis, which is this one down here, where you can see the muscle striations, the linea alba going through the umbilicus or the belly button, and then these tendinous cross sections that divide that muscle. That is different than what we call the anterior rectus sheath, which is a piece of connective tissue covering the rectus abdominis. Notice how you can't really even see the muscle fiber orientations on this picture up here because it's got that rectus sheath on top. Same thing down here, you can see the rectus sheath, but now they've highlighted just the linea alba as this middle piece of connective tissue holding together those two sides. And lastly, I'm going to draw the black lines for the muscle fiber orientation, and now you can see the external obliques forming the V shape. That's the external obliques on the cadaver. But you know what? There's one more abdominal muscle, and I haven't even talked about it yet. It's the transverse abdominis, maybe my favorite and most important muscle in the body. Definitely of the trunk, but I might even say in the body, because this one is going to do a super important job that you may have never even heard about before. And that is the job of compressing and stabilizing the spine to the vertebral column in the pelvis. So imagine this is like a belt surrounding your midsection, your abdominal section, and holding everything in place. If you're out of alignment, then that can cause a lot of issues for the spinal cord. So this transverse abdominis right here, a muscle that has transverse fibers running horizontally, as you can see here, horizontally, wrapping around the lateral side the anterior side, as well as a little bit posterior as well. So you got a posterior view, lateral view, and anterior view of that transverse abdominis muscle. And this is the deepest of all the abdominal muscles. But you know what? The reason why you may have never heard of it before is hopefully it's already working on its own. But if not, this is the action that it would take right here. So this video is going through all of them here, but what I want you to watch with this transverse abdominis is the action of it as it compresses against the vertebral column here. They're about to show you the action, so take a watch right up here. Here we go. Watch this as it just compresses inward. You guys catch that? Small action there. I'm going to rewind it so you can see it again, but watch it compress on in and press back against the rib cage and vertebral column. Now, as a personal trainer and a coach, the cue that I usually give for this is you want to stand up against a flat wall. So go ahead and stand up against a flat wall and then take your belly button or your umbilicus and push it back into the wall. So you want to push your belly button, which on this video here, the belly button would be right about here, umbilicus, and compress it or push it as posteriorly as you can go, and that is the contraction of your TVA. Now down here is another video I'll let you watch to how to contract that muscle. All right, enough with the anterior abdominals. We're on to the posterior side, the back, and we got a few trunk muscles to talk about here. Again, just reminders that this is back extension, and the back muscles will pull your body into back extension. And I want you to note that if the anterior muscles flex, the posterior muscles will extend. Just like the anterior part of your arm, your biceps, flexes, and your posterior part of your arm, your triceps, extend. That is a very common relationship that will help you in memorizing these muscles. First up to look at are the erector spinae muscles here. There's a whole bit of them. Let's just call them the big back muscles. And when we look at them on the superficial view, they look like these columns going down the entire person's back. So they actually run all the way from way up in here in the neck down to the pelvis. That's the erector spinae muscle. And these muscles are doing that back extension. Watch this video down here of this person working out and going into back extension. That's the erector spinae muscle. Next up, we've got the rhomboids and the trapezius. This is like the middle back region here. So if I were to kind of draw on this, it'd be down here, kind of forming a diamond type shape or a rhombus or however you want to look at it. But within there, you've got the trapezius on this side and the rhomboids are deeper. So on the right side of this skeleton, they've removed the trapezius so that you can see the rhomboids. And here the rhomboids are by themselves. Take a look down here, kind of forming that rhombus type shape. And what they do is scapular retraction. If you grab something and you pull it back and you row your shoulder blades into scapular retraction or pinch your shoulder blades together, that's your rhomboids doing that action. So definitely watch that short video at the bottom. And for now, the trapezius also does scapular retraction, but it's more superficial in addition to those rhomboids that are deeper. All right, final muscle for you with the trunk muscles of the body, and this is the last slide in this PowerPoint slideshow. It's the diaphragm. Don't forget about the diaphragm. It's actually skeletal muscle that's involuntarily contracted. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? But when we think about it, the diaphragm inspires or allows you to breathe in. And you don't have to think about breathing, right? Breathing just kind of happens on its own. So that's why it's involuntary. But what we can see here is that the diaphragm is deep within the rib cage, dividing what we call the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So it's attached to these ribs, and then it's attached deep in there in something called the central tendon. And when you inspire, you contract your diaphragm and it flattens. So it would pull downward on the rib cage, or producing more space for your lungs to inflate. That makes sense, right? You want more room in your rib cage for your lungs to inflate. Now, when you expire, your diaphragm relaxes and it arches up. And if that arches back up, that's going to push air out of your lungs, which is exactly what you want to do when you expire. So make sure you know diaphragm and difference between inspiration and expiration. And last thing to note, the diaphragm is innervated by a nerve called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve innervates that diaphragm. All right, that's the end of this lab discussion video. This week, the upper body and the lower body all are set up in very similar fashion where you want to know the joints, you want to know the muscles, the ligaments of those areas of the body. So get this theme down now and you'll do really well in the next couple of weeks. But I think I got to go back to